Donald Henry Gaskins was a serial killer who committed multiple murders in the southeastern United States. His crimes were extremely violent and showed a disturbing disregard for human life. He was particularly fond of torturing his victims, using tools like pliers, piano wire, and ice picks to inflict excruciating pain. This gruesome series of murders and mutilations made him known as the meanest man in America. Gaskins was born on March 13, 1933, in Florence County, South Carolina. His mother was Molly, a poor girl who left school at 12 to help pick cotton and grow tobacco, and his real father was never in his life. Gaskins had a very sad childhood. He accidentally drank some kerosene when he was a year old, which caused him to have intermittent spasms for many years afterward. His mother, Molly, had many short-tempered and alcoholic lovers, as well as casual sex with men for money. Gaskins was often abused and sexually assaulted by those men. Molly, who just watched him being beaten, never protected him. His family was poor and he lacked love from his mother, so Gaskins' diet was very poor. He was often starved and frozen, so his height and weight developed very slowly. He was teased at school by other children because of his small size and scars. Gaskins' teacher was also a significant factor in pushing him into the abyss. Whenever Gaskins got into an argument with other students, his teacher always had the preconceived notion that it was his fault, instead of choosing to treat every child equally. Even if other students reject Gaskins, the teacher will not help him. Instead, he feels that Gaskins has caused a lot of trouble. So Gaskins becomes sick of going to school and hides in the woods all day long. He doesn't want to go to school and he doesn't want to go home. For him, going to school would be criticized and physically punished by the teachers, and going home would be abused by his mother's lover. In 1943, a field laborer named Hannah became Gaskins' stepfather, and Gaskins expected Hannah to be kind to him. But this man, like Molly's former lovers, abused him often, even more viciously than those men. His mother had 2 more sons and 2 daughters after marriage, but it was clear that Gaskins had been the least popular in the family. To sum up, Gaskins didn't have a happy childhood. He was also subjected to mental and physical torture, which had a significant impact on his psychological development and later criminal behavior. Gaskins dropped out of school at the age of 11 because the school atmosphere was particularly depressing. After dropping out, his mother strong-armed him into working in a local garage. There, Gaskins met 2 friends, Danny and Marsh, who got together and called themselves the Trouble Trio. They did all sorts of criminal things, like burglary, pimping, and even raping little boys. Not only that, but they would use intimidation tactics on boys who tried to call the police after being attacked to prevent them from doing so. However, this sinful gang soon fell apart because one time, Marsh made a deranged suggestion that he take Gaskins and Danny with him to sexually assault his sister. As a result, Marsh's dad found out about their misdeeds, and he caught them, tied them to a tree, and beat them hard with a stick until their clothes were soaked with blood. After this brutal beating, the 3 young men went their separate ways. Danny and Marsh left the area, while Gaskins, having nowhere else to go, stayed in the area and continued to commit crimes like burglary. Gaskins' life was changed by a crime he committed when he was just 13 years old. He was burglarizing a resident's home when he was interrupted by a young girl with an axe who tried to drive him away. But Gaskins snatched the axe and he ran away after cutting the girl. Fortunately, the girl survived the attack. When she identified Gaskins as the suspect, the police arrested him right away. At the trial that followed, the court charged Gaskins with assault with a deadly weapon and attempted murder. It also sentenced him to stay at the South Carolina Industrial School for Boys until he turned 18. It was during this court hearing that Gaskins is said to have first learned that his full name was Donald Henry Gaskins. Gaskins' time at the reform school was defined by violence and abuse. He was often targeted by other boys because he was small. He had to accept the protection of the boss boys at the dorm if he wanted to survive. In return, he had to provide sexual favors. He later escaped from the reform school and ended up at a traveling carnival, where he met a young 13-year-old girl. They got married, so Gaskins went back to the reform school to serve the rest of his sentence until 1951, when he was released on his 18th birthday. Once he was free, Gaskins started working on a tobacco farm. This led to his involvement in an insurance scam, in which he and a partner charged local tobacco farmers to burn down their barns. When a young girl taunted him, he didn't hesitate to attack her with a hammer. He was sentenced to another 5 years in prison for assault with a deadly weapon and attempted murder. In prison, Gaskins wanted to be one of the most powerful people in prison, so he killed Hazel Brazel, the most terrible man in prison. Then he commanded the respect of his fellow inmates and was feared by all. But, in the eyes of the law, he was sentenced to another 3 years and 6 months in solitary confinement for involuntary manslaughter. In 1955, Gaskins' wife filed for divorce, so he devised a plan to break out of prison. He hid in a garbage truck because the guards were distracted by the garbage. He escaped and made his way to Florida. He then got a job at a traveling carnival and met a girl. They got married, but 2 weeks later they divorced. Gaskins also encountered con artists during this time. On that day, he met a woman named Betty Gates, and after some exchanges, Gaskins traveled with her to Tennessee to help Gates' brother. However, when they arrived at their destination, the woman suddenly disappeared. And Gaskins then discovered that her brother was actually her husband, and that the man was an escaped fugitive from prison. When the police arrived at the hotel where they were staying, they discovered that Gaskins was also an escaped convict, and sent them both back to prison. After being paroled in 1962, Gaskins was arrested again for raping a 12-year-old girl. To avoid the law, he stole a car and fled to North Carolina. While on the run, Gaskins married a third and later a fourth time, but he found that monogamy wasn't for him. His last wife was only 17 at the time, and she eventually told the police that he'd raped her. This led to his arrest in Columbia, SC. He was released from prison in 1968 and moved to Sumter Township, SC, where he started working for a roofing company. A year later, Gaskins picked up a blonde female hitchhiker on the highway. When he tried to have sex with her, she laughed at him, which he found unacceptable. He beat her, knocked her unconscious, raped and sodomized her, and then sank her body in a swamp. In his memoir, he said, "All I could think about was how to do whatever I wanted to her." Throughout the 1970s, Gaskins kept committing crimes, driving on the highways of South Carolina looking for victims. He said that the rape, torture, and murder he committed were a disturbing sensation that he had experienced throughout his life. He also said that he had mastered the skill of torture, which allowed him to torment his victims for days. In some cases, he even ate the flesh of his victims. However, the police did not find evidence that Gaskins murdered these people, so it cannot verify these claims. In November 1970, Gaskins committed the first of several confirmed murders. His first victims were his 15-year-old niece, Janice Kirby, and her 17-year-old friend, Patricia Ann Alsbrook. Gaskins said the girls thought he was taking them home, but instead he drove them to an abandoned house where he beat, raped, and drowned them. In March 1971 or 1972, Gaskins murdered 20-year-old Martha Ann Dix, also known as Clyde's murder. There are many explanations as to why he murdered Dix. Someone says is that he was the father of Dick's unborn child. He killed Dix out of revenge. Another possibility is that he felt betrayed when Dix moved to Texas after getting married. Eventually, Dix's remains were found in a ditch, but they were later lost when they were sent to a university for research. So this case will never be fully understood. Gaskins also owned a hearse during his criminal career. He used it to lure hitchhikers on the highway and to transport the bodies of the victims he killed. It became his signature mode of transportation. He seemed to have no qualms about displaying it in public. In fact, he even allegedly put a sticker on the back of the hearse that read, "We transport anything, alive or dead." Gaskins was also a racist guy. In June 1973, he raped and drowned 22-year-old Doreen Hope Dempsey and her 2-year-old daughter, Robin Nichelle Dempsey. Doreen was 22 and pregnant with her second child. Gaskins was upset about her relationship with an African-American man and her second pregnancy. He was driven by heightened and disturbing feelings that led to the brutal murder of Doreen and her child. That day, Gaskins took Doreen to his backyard pond, where he drowned her and her children. In June 1974, Gaskins committed the brutal murders of 2 acquaintances, Johnny Sellers, age 36, and Jessie Ruth Judy, age 22. Gaskins had been involved in a boat theft crime with Sellers. By the time he had sold the stolen boat, but failed to pay Sellers the dirty money, he was afraid that Sellers would reveal to the police that he had been involved in the theft and sale of the boat. In an effort to remove potential witnesses, he shot and killed Sellers. And Judy, who was also aware of his criminal activities and had witnessed his killing of Sellers, took a knife and stabbed Judy to death again. In February 1975, 45-year-old Silas Barnwell Yates was killed by him by slitting his throat. At his trial, the coroner concluded that Silas was taken to be killed with a knife, but Gaskins disputed this, saying he was killed with a karate machete. And this murder was directed by Silas's former girlfriend, Suzanne Kipper Owens, and her husband John Owens, who were involved in an argument with Silas at the time, and who then paid Gaskins $1,500 to kill Silas. On April 10, 1975, Diane Bellamy Neely and Avery Leroy Howard were murdered. At the time, Diane was separated from her husband, Walter Neely, who was one of Gaskins' closest associates and an accomplice in his criminal activities. That day, Gaskins proceeded to stab Diane to death with a knife, citing her previous threat to report him to the police for allowing underage teenagers to engage in sexual intercourse on his premises. Meanwhile, Avery Leroy Howard, aged 34, was also killed due to the necessity of procuring funds to remunerate his legal counsel following his apprehension on charges of fraud and auto theft. Gaskins feared that Howard would divulge information about his criminal activities to the police and thus took a firearm and killed him. And then, 13-year-old Kim Gelkin was kidnapped by Gaskins in North Charleston, and she was sexually abused by many adult men, including Gaskins. Fearing that she would report the incident to the police, Gaskins stabbed her to death. October 10, 1975, was the murder of Dennis Bellamy, 27 years old, and John Henry Knight, 15 years old. They are also Diane's brothers. Dennis had stolen a number of guns from a gun store, and Gaskins was trying to pay for the guns, but when he got them, he did not pay money. And when Dennis came to confront him, he offered to return the guns in the woods behind his house. When Dennis followed him to the woods, he shot and killed the unsuspecting Dennis. In order to eliminate all the witnesses, Gaskins told Dennis's brother, John, that Dennis was waiting for him in this grove. When John arrived at the grove, Gaskins killed John in the same manner to ensure that his crime would never be revealed. Gaskins was arrested by the police on November 14, 1975. Walter had told the police that Gaskins had always told him that he had killed several people listed as missing within the past 5 years, and he also indicated where those victims were buried. On December 4, 1975, Walter led the police search the area near Gaskins' home and found the bodies of several victims. Eventually, on May 24, 1976, Gaskins was tried for murder, convicted on May 28, and sentenced to death. However, the sentence was later commuted to life in prison. On March 18, 1978, Rudolph Tyner, 23, killed Bill and Myrtle Moon at the Morals Inlet convenience store. After a court trial, he was sentenced to death and held on death row in CCI prison. Then he immediately appealed his death sentence. Tony Chimo, the son of Bill and Myrtle Moon, knew Tyner was appealing only to delay his execution. So he paid $2,000 to hire Gaskins in prison to kill Tyner. Gaskins attempted to kill Tyner on several occasions but was unsuccessful. He ultimately devised an elaborate plan to murder him. First, he instructed Tony to insert some C4 explosives into the heel and mail it to him. He then took some wires, radios, and speakers to make a remote-controlled plastic explosive. On September 12, 1982, Gaskins ordered Tyner to test the device. He boldly claimed that the device could allow Tyner to contact the outside world in prison. After Tyner put the device on his ear, he immediately detonated the provisional bomb, and Tyner died instantly. However, the murder case sentenced Gaskins to death again, which was executed on September 6, 1991. Tony was also accused of murder but was eventually sentenced to only 8 years in prison and released on parole in 1986. While in prison, Gaskins also said he committed between 100 and 110 murders, including that of Margaret Peg Coutinho, the 13-year-old daughter of the then South Carolina senator. These murders were indeed widely disputed, but there is no reasonable evidence that would prove that he was telling the truth. On the night of September 5, 1991, which for Gaskins was the only hours left of his life, he attempted to slit his wrists in order to escape execution in the electric chair, but was discovered by guards watching him, and then he was stitched up by a doctor. Hours later, on September 6, 1991, Gaskins was executed, his last words being, "I'll let my liver speak for me. I'm ready to go."